On September 26, 2008, the world lost one of its last true Hollywood legends. Paul Newman, the piercing blue-eyed icon of American cinema, died at age 83 after a quiet battle with lung cancer. His passing marked the end of an era, one defined not just by his magnetic screen presence in classics like The Hustler and Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid, but by a life of fierce independence, principled generosity, and guarded privacy. Behind the scenes, Newman had meticulously arranged his estate, estimated at over $600 million, including earnings from decades in film, his racing career, and the wildly successful Newman's Own Food empire, which had donated hundreds of millions to charity. But when it came to his 6 children, the picture became more complicated. A revised will, signed just months before his death, placed much of his estate into trusts managed by advisors, with no clear guarantee of equal division. Some assets went to charity, some to Joanne Woodward, his wife of 50 years, who would later slip into dementia. For the Newman children, 3 from his first marriage and 3 from his second, the inheritance wasn't just about money. It became a question of legacy, fairness, and the burden of carrying a name synonymous with both greatness and restraint. This is the story of Paul Newman and what became of the 6 children living in the shadow of his fame. Number 1, Scott Newman, the firstborn son who carried the name but not the legacy. He was Paul Newman's eldest child, born in 1950 before the Oscars, before the racing, before Butch Cassidy and the salad dressing empire. Scott Newman came into the world when Paul was still a struggling actor married to his first wife, Jackie White. There was no fame yet, just a small apartment, theater rehearsals, and the grind of young parenthood. But as Paul's career exploded, Scott's life quietly unraveled in the background. By the time The Hustler made his father a household name, Scott was being shuffled between schools, cities, and emotional climates. He didn't grow up in Hollywood. He grew up just outside of it, watching his father rise from the sidelines. And even as a child, he seemed to understand that the man who signed autographs wasn't the same one who forgot birthdays. As a teenager, Scott wrestled with a storm of emotions, abandonment, resentment, and a desperate craving for attention. At 16, he was already drinking heavily. By 18, he had been in trouble with the law more than once. His parents' divorce had severed the last thread of normalcy in his life, and Joanne Woodward's arrival as Paul's second wife only deepened his sense of being pushed aside. While Paul and Joanne built a glamorous household filled with the awards and designer kitchens, Scott felt like the son from a forgotten chapter. Still, he tried to connect the only way he thought he could, by becoming an actor. He studied the craft, mimicked his father's expressions, and landed minor roles in films like The Great Waldo Pepper. But Hollywood had no mercy. The comparisons to his father were relentless, and Scott couldn't escape the brutal truth. The same name that opened doors also crushed his identity. In his 20s, Scott spiraled. The auditions slowed, the substance abuse worsened. He took up stunt work to make ends meet, but carried the air of someone drowning in expectations. Paul Newman tried to intervene, offering rehab, guidance, even silence when necessary. But he never found the language to reach his son. He wasn't me, Paul would later admit, and I didn't know how to be what he needed. Scott's final years were spent in private torment. He drifted between LA apartments, clung to fading relationships, and never quite let go of the feeling that he disappointed the only person whose approval he ever wanted. In 1978, he was found dead from an accidental overdose of alcohol and Valium. He was 28. The twist came after. Unknown to most, Scott had recorded a private message months before his death, a cassette tape addressed to Paul. It was never released. But according to family whispers, it wasn't a goodbye. It was a confession, a confrontation, a desperate plea not to be remembered as a failure. That tape was kept by Joanne Woodward, unopened for years, until she finally handed it to Paul during one of his final summers in Westport. No one knows what was said afterward. Paul never spoke publicly about it, but after Scott's death, he founded the Scott Newman Center, not as a tribute, but as a warning. He never wrote Scott into the will, never reissued his films, never told the world what that tape said. Of all 6 children, Scott was the only son who carried the name Newman, and the only one who died not from obscurity, but from proximity to a legacy too heavy to bear. Number 2, Susan Kendall Newman, the daughter who asked the questions no one else would. Born in 1953, Susan was Paul Newman's second child and first daughter, arriving during the final years of his first marriage to Jackie Weddy. She was bright, observant, and early on learned to read tension like a script. By the time she was 5, her father was already slipping away, not physically, but emotionally, into the arms of Hollywood and soon Joanne Woodward. While her brother Scott rebelled, Susan watched in silence, internalizing the fractures that would later define her role in the family. When the divorce came, she was barely old enough to understand why, but old enough to remember that her father's new life no longer included her in the headlines. As a teenager, Susan split time between schools and homes, never quite finding one she could call her own. She tried acting briefly but found the camera uninterested. Instead, she studied theater, then pivoted to producing and nonprofit work, carving out a space behind the scenes where the Newman name carried influence, but not expectation. Her life was shaped by contrasts: public admiration for her father, private tension over his choices. She supported his philanthropy but questioned his absence. She praised his generosity to strangers while wondering why parts of his family were left guessing. In adulthood, Susan devoted herself to healthcare advocacy and social justice work, stepping far away from the glamour her parents embodied. She rarely used the Newman name publicly, but everything changed after Paul's death in 2008, when the revised estate documents revealed that most of the fortune would be controlled by outside trustees, and his children largely cut from decision-making roles. Susan didn't stay silent. She called for an investigation. She asked what happened to the original version of the will. She accused the foundation of drifting from her father's intent. Susan later revealed she was asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement just months after Paul's death, an NDA tied not to money but to silence. She refused, and from that moment the family would never be united again. Number 3, Stephanie Newman, the vanishing daughter of a Hollywood giant. Born around 1954, Stephanie was Paul Newman's third child and the quietest shadow in the family. If Scott was the troubled son and Susan the defiant daughter, then Stephanie was the mystery no one could fully explain. She arrived just as Paul's career was accelerating into full stardom. But unlike her siblings, she never tried to step into the spotlight, or even near it. Her name rarely appeared in articles, biographies, or family interviews. As Susan battled publicly over legacy and Scott struggled with identity, Stephanie quietly disappeared from the narrative. But she was always there, in the photos, the early records, and later, the silences. In her teenage years, Stephanie was reportedly sent to a boarding school in the Northeast, a decision her mother Jackie Whitey made after Paul remarried Joanne Woodward. She kept to herself, avoided interviews, and resisted the idea of being a Newman. While her siblings were featured in family documentaries or invited to Newman's own events, Stephanie remained absent, by choice or by design. Some insiders claim she worked in publishing under a different last name. Others said she had renounced her inheritance early, but no one in the family spoke publicly about her, not even Paul. As an adult, Stephanie lived far from California or Connecticut, away from the family homes. She never appeared at the serious fun events. She didn't sit on the board of the Newman Foundation. Her address was unlisted, her life undocumented. But when Paul died in 2008, Stephanie's absence from the will shocked even those who had long believed she was distant. Her name wasn't mentioned once, not in the trusts, not in the foundation charters, not in the family statements. A legal document from 1999, buried in court archives, showed that Stephanie had once been included in Paul's original estate plans. But in the final revision, months before his death, her name was removed without explanation. No one contested it, and to this day, she remains the only Newman child about whom the public knows almost nothing, except that she existed, and then, by all appearances, she chose to disappear. Number 4, Eleanor Nell Newman, the heir apparent who was quietly erased. Born in 1959, Nell was Paul Newman's fourth child and the first from his second marriage to Joanne Woodward. Unlike her older half-siblings, Nell didn't grow up with a memory of struggle. She was raised in the polished, art-filled home of two Oscar-winning parents in Westport, Connecticut. But with privilege came pressure. From an early age, Nell was expected to be sharp, composed, and worthy of the Newman-Woodward legacy, yet she never chased fame. Instead, she turned to nature, conservation, and food, far from the red carpets that had defined her parents' world. As a teenager, Nell often helped in the kitchen and volunteered at local co-ops. She studied environmental policy and animal conservation, quietly forming her identity far from the public eye. But she watched closely as her father's charity empire grew. By her late 20s, she proposed an idea to launch Newman's Own Organics, a separate brand under the Newman's Own umbrella that would promote sustainable food. Paul approved. The company launched in 1993 with Nell as its president, and it became a rare success, a business that was both mission-driven and family-led. She was finally seen, not as an actress, but as a leader with her father's vision. For years, Nell was the natural face of the Newman legacy, appearing at food expos, leading environmental campaigns, and earning respect in philanthropic circles. But everything shifted after Paul's death. In the revised structure of Newman's Own foundation, Nell found herself quietly sidelined. The foundation's leadership changed. Outside trustees took over. And in 2020, Nell was removed from the board. No announcement, no tribute, just silence. Nell later discovered a confidential clause inserted shortly before Paul's death that granted long-term control to a third-party advisory group, barring any family members from decision-making after a decade. Her own name, once a symbol of continuity, became a legal conflict. She had built a business carrying her father's face, but ended up shut out from the very system he inspired. And though she continues her work in food justice independently, the empire that bears her name now lives on without her. Number 5, Lissy Newman, the voice that never asked for a stage. Born in 1961, Lissy was the second daughter of Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, growing up in the same picturesque Westport estate that had once inspired magazine covers and Hollywood envy. But unlike Nell, who stepped into the public arena through philanthropy, Lissy remained soft-spoken, content to linger in the quiet corners of the family's creative world. She inherited her mother's gentle demeanor and her father's artistic instincts, yet chose a different instrument entirely: music. While her sisters sparred over foundations and legacies, Lissy kept her head low, her melodies soft, and her intentions private. In her teenage years, she immersed herself in classical piano and jazz vocals, often performing in school recitals with a self-assured restraint. She wasn't chasing applause, she was chasing clarity. Her parents, immersed in film and charity, offered support but gave her space. When Nell launched Organics and Clea embraced the nonprofit network, Lissy stayed rooted in the arts. She appeared briefly in small television roles, even co-starred in an off-Broadway play. But it was music that called her most. She recorded a jazz album in her 30s and performed occasionally under a low profile. Fans of her work noted an almost haunted quality in her songs: elegant, personal, and aching for something unsaid. As the Newman family estate entered its post-Paul era, Lissy remained publicly distant. She didn't contest the will, didn't attend public board meetings, and didn't weigh in on the legal struggles that rippled through the foundation. Instead, she stayed in Connecticut with her husband and children, preserving what remained of her own privacy. Her name was included in private family trusts, but she never became a face of the brand. She had no interest in the Newman's Own bureaucracy. But that didn't mean her work was untouched by it. A melody Lissy composed in her 20s, never commercially released, was quietly used in a short promotional video for Newman's Own Foundation in 2016. Her name was never credited. The music had been passed through internal channels, likely by a well-meaning employee, but the omission stung. Lissy never made a public statement, but those close to her say she never offered another piece of music to the family foundation again. She remains the most private of the 6 children, a talented artist who never sought the limelight, and who now carries the family name in hushed tones and unresolved chords. Number 6, Clea Newman, the last daughter still carrying the flame. Born in 1965, Clea was the youngest of Paul Newman's 6 children, the final thread in a lineage stretched between 2 marriages, 2 worlds, and 2 vastly different legacies. By the time she entered grade school, her father was no longer just a star. He was a movement, an Oscar winner, a philanthropist, a race car driver, a salad dressing mogul. But to Clea, he was still just dad, quiet at the dinner table, intense at the racetrack, and never fully able to clock out from being Paul Newman. Growing up, she observed the toll that fame and ambition had taken on her older siblings. She learned early not to fight for attention, but to earn her place through service, steadiness, and loyalty. In her teenage years, Clea avoided acting altogether, choosing instead to work behind the scenes. On school events, local fundraisers, and disability advocacy efforts. She studied communications in college, not theater, and by the time she graduated, she had already begun volunteering with programs for children with serious illnesses. Her calling wasn't art, it was impact. As her siblings either withdrew or splintered under the weight of inheritance politics, Clea became the bridge. The one who stayed close to Joanne Woodward, the one who showed up at Serious Fun Children's Network camps, and the one the board could always count on to speak calmly at a press conference. In adulthood, Clea became a central figure in maintaining her father's humanitarian legacy. She traveled the world representing Serious Fun, quietly raised millions for children's care, and rarely spoke to the media unless it was about a cause bigger than herself. Even as her half-sister Susan raised alarms about Paul's will, and Nell was removed from the foundation's board, Clea stayed diplomatic, choosing cooperation over conflict. But inside the walls of Newman's own foundation, power was shifting. Outside consultants were replacing family voices. New branding teams spoke in corporate language that her father would have hated. In 21, Clea was privately offered a legacy position, a ceremonial title with no decision-making power, in exchange for stepping back from governance. It was a quiet way to sideline her without a fight. For weeks, she considered it, and then she declined. Clea remains the only child still publicly associated with the Newman brand, still attending the foundation's events, still fighting, gently, persistently, for her father's original vision. But even she admits now, sometimes I don't recognize the thing we built. She is the last Newman standing in the house that Paul made, keeping the porch light on, even as the foundation it sits on continues to shift beneath her feet. But Paul Newman's story is only one thread in a far more fragile tapestry, a world where the glow of legacy can cast the longest shadows. Behind the philanthropic empire and the silver screen triumphs were 6 children pulled in different directions. One lost to addiction, one silenced by omission, one erased from legal memory, and others caught between loyalty and disillusionment. His name became a brand, his face a symbol of goodness. But inside the family bearing that name, fracture lines formed in silence. The will changed, the trust shifted. And what remained wasn't just salad dressing in charity camps. It was a question no estate can answer. What happens to a family when the icon is gone and the image outlives the man? Beyond the Newmans are other names, other dynasties, other children shaped by gold-plated legacies and the quiet ache of being second to the spotlight. In the episodes ahead, we'll open those doors, stories the tabloids missed, the studios buried, and the families never wanted told. Stay close because the next secret waits just beyond the legend. If you don't want to miss what comes next, subscribe to Legacy Uncovered and join us as we reveal more untold lives behind the icons. Thank you for listening.